right? Psalm 104, let's call this one Freedom Without the Side Effects of Trying to Do Too Much. A theme I've talked about a little bit before, really way back in Genesis, at least that too much part of it. But I'm combining it with this week's theme because this psalm reminded me that in its discussion of, in the first few verses, first 4 or so, God. And then in the middle passage, pretty much all the way to the end of the chapter, it's going to talk about the way in which he designed the earth. And to the psalmist, the wisdom and the apparent structure that he has placed on the earth. And then beyond that, at the end, there might be a subsection, a third section, where the psalmist goes back to talking about himself and some things that he recognizes that he would like to pick up from the wisdom that he sees in what God has done. But in that middle section, it seemed to break down to at least 2 other sections that caught my attention, or 2 other themes. And those 2 themes are, one, God's provision, and then his boundaries. And as we mentioned in the sermon on this chapter, provision can actually be a curse, or an abundance can actually be a curse without proper boundaries. And so it seems that the wisdom that the psalmist picks up and what he notices about what God has done is him giving us an abundant provision with the kind of boundaries that allow us to actually enjoy it, as opposed to having the kind of abundance that just creates more chaos. And the thing that I left out as I was debating which illustrations to leave in the sermon and which to kind of hold back maybe for a 5-minute lesson, the illustration we went with was the one of a co-worker that I had who trained me in when I mentioned from time to time, who was a joy to work with, because even though he had to set boundaries over and above what the company guidelines might have been, he was flexible enough to know that his boundaries were not the company boundaries, and that when his boundaries didn't necessarily work in every situation, he had to make adjustments. And so in life, we said that the word does not always afford us the luxury of being able to look to it for every decision that we have to make. And so we're going to have to make some decisions that often involve setting boundaries, but we likewise may be at our best when we understand the difference between our boundaries and God's boundaries, and are flexible enough to make adjustments when our boundaries seem like they might not fit every situation. But in setting those boundaries, something else came to mind that I didn't have time to mention on Sunday, and that is Caesar, the dog whisperer, who could have probably been a sub-theme for this chapter, because I remember one of the few times the dog whisperer got bit, he was showing dog owners how to set boundaries between their dogs and one of their most basic instincts, and that's their food drive, or their prey drive. And so when he was showing with the golden retriever, a relatively tame breed of dog compared to what he's used to dealing with in the ways of pit bulls and Rottweilers and other breeds known more for biting, he played around with this dog's food one time too many when he had that dog effectively under control, and that dog bit him. And that reminded me that in times when God has put us in positions of authority, it can become otherwise intoxicating to have the power to set boundaries over other people. However, when we mention this whole concept of side effects, sometimes when we try to do too much with the freedom that God has given us to set boundaries on either our lives or the lives of others, that power, unfortunately, if you're like me, can sometimes go to my head and result in me getting bit, even by people who are not ordinarily inclined to bite and lash out when they're frustrated. And so one of the lasting lessons from this chapter seems to be the way in which God is guiding us in a way that helps us not simply respond to a command that tells us every detail of what we need to do, but he may be training us to develop our wisdom to create boundaries in ways that actually help the people he has empowered us to lead and care for, as opposed to setting boundaries in places that simply frustrate them in ways God never intended. Which is why we often say God's best to you as you go forward in him. God willing, not trying to do too much, as you said.